Welcome to Elixir Mix, your weekly Elixir podcast talking with members of the community. My name is Mark Ericksen, and today on our panel we have Josh Adams.
How goes?
And today we have a special guest, Griffin Byatt. Griffin, can you say hi?
Hey there.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
So we invited you on to talk about a few different things, mainly as information around security analysis of Phoenix applications, and a library you've written to that effect. But before we get into all that, could you just give us a little background about kind of where you came from professionally and what you're doing?
Yeah, sure. So I guess just a little about me. I used to do web development back in the day, and so that's kind of how I found Elixir. I was doing like Django and Rails applications, so I think I found Elixir the same way just about everyone else did, which is just looking for something that felt more right. And then for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been doing security as well. And for the last 3 years, I've been a security consultant at NCC Group.
Now, I thought that was an interesting idea of, being a security consultant, and because Elixir is a fairly new language, right? And so, I knew a lot of security consultants, they had their background with Java or Rails or something like that. So I thought it was really cool, though, that you had this Elixir experience and interest. So I'm just curious as to how you ended up being both a security consultant and like doing Elixir at the same time. How did that happen?
Yeah, I guess like I said, I used to do development, so that part was kind of natural. And when I found Elixir, for whatever reason, I was just like, I want to know everything about this language. And then with Phoenix, it was kind of the same thing. And that's just sort of a natural place for security to come from. Just the more you know, the more you can find.
Yeah. And so with NCC Group, what kinds of, like if I'm a business and I need to, before the show, we were talking about how a lot of times security is a primary concern when people are dealing with a compliance environment, either PCI or SOC 2 or something. There are other regulations that require you have certain practices in place. And so I was just curious, like for NCC Group, what kinds of customers do they have? Who would, like if I have a business, would they be an appropriate person to turn to for help?
Yeah. So, I can't obviously speak to like specific clients, but NCC is just a huge company. So basically, if you have a security need, NCC Group is a company that you can turn to. Specifically, I do a lot of like application security, web applications and iOS application security. So it's not your, I guess, traditional like checkboxes compliance kind of thing. It's heavy code review, design review, and things like that.
Awesome. And so I know one of the library that got my attention most was a library you wrote, which is under the NCC Group GitHub account, but it's called Sobelow. So I was wondering if you could give us a little background as to what this library is and kind of how it came into being.
Sure. So I guess how it came into being, NCC Group, one of the cool things about working with the company is you get dedicated research time. So during that time, you can kind of work on whatever you want, whatever interests you. As part of my research time, I was looking at Elixir and looking at Phoenix. And so the more that I was looking at it, the more I was recognizing common vulnerabilities, and also naturally realized that there was no tooling in the space for just automated scans. And so, as someone who'd done Rails development in the past, I was familiar with Brakeman and kind of thought that it would be good to build something in that space, or felt like that was something that was needed.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. We use it on a project that's on hold right now, but we have it running on CI for every PR, and it's super duper nice to see the report. I don't know that we're failing the build yet, but we're recording the report every time.
Nice.
So one of the questions I had so a little background on my personal experience with Sobelow. So it's spelled Sobelow, in case someone's listening to this, but a link to this is in the show notes. But so I was at a company where we had compliance, PCI compliance specifically. And one of the requirements in a PCI environment is that you have automated security scans of your code or regular security scans. So either you're paying someone to come in, or you have dedicated personnel who are doing security audits regularly, or you have like an automated tool. And when you're working in a fast development environment where you have continuous integration, continuous deployment, you really want that to be as automated as possible and to happen with every commit. And so Sobelow came out at just the right time. Like it solved a problem for me, and which was, in order to be able to say, yes, we can use Elixir in this and have this level of compliance, we need to have some kind of security scan automated, and it checked that box. Additionally, it also found some security issues that we had in the code, which was welcome find. I mean, I'm just curious if you could kind of talk a little bit about how Sobelow actually works. I assume it says it's a static analysis. Is that using like regular expressions, or is it, kind of how is it looking for problems in our code?
Yeah, sure. So this is actually, in this answer, covering a little bit about why Elixir is cool as well. So one, it walks the AST, so the abstract syntax tree, looking for different kinds of vulnerabilities. One of the nice things about Elixir being a functional language and not having just arbitrary state everywhere is that you can kind of look, not always, but for the most part, you can look at each function as a sort of microcosm. So if you see, a file.read function and it's taking in some arbitrary variable, you don't really have to look all over the place to trace down where it came from. If you're in the controller and you see that it comes from the params, you know that there's like a directory traversal there. If it's calling some other function, you think maybe it's vulnerable, but with less certainty. So I think that's, I guess, sort of a roundabout way of saying it does it both more complex than regular expressions, but still pretty simple just because of the nature of Elixir.
Do you have one particular heuristic that's in Sobelow that would be like a really solid one to look at for an example of how it's implemented?
So when I was building Sobelow, the intention was to make it first and foremost really modular, since a lot of the time it's built in my spare time or in the research time that I'm given with NCC Group. So each module is kind of really simple to understand on its own. So there's none in particular, but it's really easy to just like trace the functionality.
Cool, thanks.
And in the show notes, we should have a link for like to the file module that kind of shows how it does some of that traversal, which I think is interesting. I was just glancing at it. It's awesome. So one of the other questions I had is like, what kinds of vulnerabilities are you work with a lot of web applications, right? So there's a lot of common mistakes. Are the common mistakes that you'd see in a PHP or a Django or a Java app, are they the same kinds of mistakes you're seeing in Elixir, or does Elixir have a few like a different flair or kind of different things that you look for?
So by and large, for sure, it's very common to find the same vulnerabilities across different languages or different frameworks. Directory traversal is going to be the same everywhere, but each language also does have its own unique areas where people can mess up. So, PHP, you've got the type coercion where a double equal sign can mean someone gets access to just an arbitrary session or something like that. Elixir, fortunately, doesn't have issues that severe, especially anymore. But you do see the Elixir specific things like denial of service via atom creation. So any of the string to atom or to term sort of functions can cause denial of service. Something that I have noticed is that for whatever reason, Phoenix applications seem to have more directory traversal than just arbitrary applications. And I think that might have something to do with just how nice and easy it is to handle files with the framework. And it's nothing really Elixir specific. And then I guess outside of that, of course, there's the just Beam related things. So something that I notice a lot, and so this isn't necessarily in like an Elixir or an Erlang application itself, but if there's a larger deployment and Erlang just plays a small part in it, where maybe whoever's deploying it isn't necessarily aware of the functionality, I do notice the remote code execution issues with having an exposed magic cookie and just the EPMD port just wide open. So they're basically clustering when they're not intending to.
Interesting. And is that just because maybe they're not running behind a firewall and have it properly locked off?
Yeah, I think that the heart of any security issue is you expect something to work one way and it doesn't work that way. And so when you're working with a language that you have no idea what it's doing, you can run into issues like that.
So one of the issues you mentioned there was Atom with the denial of service by converting user input into an atom. So this is a thing that I'm glad to see there's enough attention, I think, where people keep hearing about it as people come and join the Elixir. But I think it's worth talking about it again just to kind of understand what's going on here. So like one of the things to understand is in the Beam, you have an atom lookup table, which is an index of all of the atoms that are defined in your application, and it is not garbage collected. And so the hazard is when you're taking, like what you were talking about, user provided data and doing like an atom to string on it, or I'm sorry, string to atom, and then it, making user defined data become a new atom, and that becomes added to the global lookup table, and it is not garbage collected for the whole duration that your application is running. And if someone was malicious and they keep causing new atoms to be created, it will eventually run out of memory and crash the whole Beam. So, I mean, is that a fair statement of how that works?
Yeah, really well said.
All right, and so I love some of the other things that Sobelow is kind of looking for, and some of them I think they're worth mentioning here, like SQL injection. Even with Ecto, I think some people still, maybe from habits, from coming from other languages, they're still may craft their own SQL. Is that where you kind of see that, or like is there something we should be looking out for, how we might be accidentally causing a SQL injection problem?
So I guess just to plug the Elixir web ecosystem even more, there's really nothing you need to be looking out for there. Just I think I mentioned in my talk, it used to be really, 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 really hard to introduce SQL injection in your Phoenix application. There was some recent updates that made it a little easier, but it's still really, really hard. So you have to be, explicitly introduce an issue and just be basically leaving Ecto behind to worry about SQL injection.
Well, that is a really nice thing to hear, just as someone, because what I think is fascinating about the whole security kind of space is you have someone who is building an application with the mindset of, I just want to make this work. And I'm just trying to get it to work and like accomplish a goal so I can move on to the next thing. And then you have an adversarial perspective, which is, how can I make this break? And so it's nice when you can have that adversarial perspective in-house. So it's prior to a bad guy coming at you, where that can be either through QA or security tools or just having, occasional audits. But is there any advice that you would give to people about how they can try and look at their code, or, when they're doing a review of someone else's code, what kinds of things can I do to kind of take an adversarial look at something?
Yeah. So I would say, first and foremost, I think the just intending to look at things like that is 90% of it. If you are writing code, imagining that it could be broken somehow, or if you're reviewing code, imagining that it could be broken, then it's really easy to start seeing all of the different ways it could be. The other 10% is just knowing that it's possible. So, someone who's accepting like XML documents, who's never heard of XXE, and they just think that they're parsing a document, they might not realize that they could be introducing an arbitrary file read issue just because they've never heard of it. And taking an adversarial look at that code wouldn't necessarily tell them that was something that they should be concerned about. So the other part, so that last 10% is just, I guess, seeing a lot of stuff. And so there's a book, which I'll link to, which is the Web Application Hacker's Handbook, which covers, it's kind of like the Web Application Security Bible. It is very in-depth. It's an awesome book.
Yeah, and I would just point out that given the typical disparity in trade-off value for time effort on the adversarial side versus the person writing the code side, I feel like you really do need something like Sobelow or some other automated method to at least have a fighting chance if someone actually wants to get you.
Yeah, and I think the goal with Sobelow, which I guess I haven't mentioned yet, is just that all of the kind of common issues that you could run into should be something you don't have to worry about. So, if Sobelow's not returning any kind of warning about a potential XSS or a potential directory traversal, then, there's a really, really strong chance that you don't have anything to worry about in that regard. Of course, there are a million ways that you could circumvent that, but you'd have to try.
Yeah, I think of it like a linter or the formatter. Like, it's a thing that should be part of your development process from day one or very early days. And you should get it to the point that you don't have to pay attention to it until you do. And then that frees up your brain cycles to focus on actual things that maybe some general heuristic wouldn't catch that are problems in your app. Because if you're constantly worried about the little things, it's hard to not get swamped.
Right. Like I think it's nice to have something like Sobelow where you don't necessarily have to know that going into writing Elixir, that string to Atom is going to cause problems. This will flag that for you. And you can just focus on the things that a scanner can't catch, like logical issues, which is also the easier thing to take an adversarial look at in your own code.
So one of the things I think, Josh was mentioning, it's valuable to have this up front as early as we can in a project. And if we have a continuous integration process, then that can be part of our automated tests. So as soon as we start talking about that, then, and we might want any security problems to, fail the build or the tests. And then when that happens, you think, okay, well, what about those occasions where I have validated that, okay, well, the code couldn't tell that this is safe input and I'm doing a string to Atom and it's actually safe in this case and I need to. How do I flag something to say that this is validated and safe? How is there a way to do that?
Sure. So there's a couple of different ways that you can approach that, and this is actually something that I'm working on improving as well. But there's a first and most granularly, there's a kind of commenting decorator-like pattern where you can basically leave a comment above a function that just says Sobelow skip, and then an array of the different module checks that you'd like to skip. So you can skip directory traversal for this function for whatever reason. You can also ignore classes of issues. So something that I think a lot of people probably end up ignoring is the HTTPS check, because typically, I think in a common deployment situation, people are putting this behind some kind of, or putting a Phoenix application behind some kind of TLS termination or reverse proxy. So they don't have TLS configured, but they get it. So you can, there's an ignore flag, and then you can also ignore specific files. So there's a few different options for doing that. Something that I'm working on currently, it's an open issue, but it's like a filter option so that you can only, so that it'll only hard exit on certain threshold. So Sobelow defaults, well, not even defaults, it just, anything that it thinks could possibly be a vulnerability, it'll let you know about, just because it wants to flag everything. Because basically a false positive is way less of an issue than a false negative. So that gives you a lot of low confidence findings. So there's going to be, the thing that I'm working on now is a way to say, okay, only hard exit on high confidence findings, which isn't necessarily the best move to do necessarily. But if you're really confident that all of the low confidence findings aren't an issue, then you've got that as well.
Nice. Yeah. And I was noticing before we jumped on the call that you've had, like, the latest commit was 5 hours ago. So this seems to be something that's under active development. Are you the only one working on this? Is there a team? Like, how does that work?
So I am the core team. But I think I've got like 11 contributors, and there's a few people that have made multiple contributions. But yeah, I usually wake up at like 5 and make a couple of commits.
So is this something like, if I'm interested in security and I develop a new, I don't know, a new type of check to come at, and you've already built this in a very modular way, so I have the ability to add new ones. Are you open to new commits, new contributors?
Yeah, definitely. I'm always happy to get a commit. Usually that comes in the form of like an edge case bug fix, but love help.
Nice. I know also, having used Sobelow, that a lot of what it checks for was, at first, initially, I had a little bit of difficulty getting it to analyze a umbrella application because things were split out. Like the ecto wasn't in the top level app that it was looking for. And so, but I think that's all been resolved now. And if I remember, because I was using it like that, but you could actually do, like, say, well, check this other app that doesn't have Phoenix, but it has ecto, check it for, any kind of, anything that looks like SQL injection and all that. So is it, do you feel like it works equally well with the single Phoenix app and an umbrella?
So yes and no. So it's definitely built for just like a standard Phoenix application. But if you scan each of your, if you have an umbrella application with 3 apps in it, if you scan each of them, then it has worked equally well. But the process of having to scan all of them is a little bit annoying right now, and is something that there's also an open issue for that, and I'm hoping to address it.
Yeah, but I would say if it is a CI build, then that's set up once, to check these 3 apps. So I think that's acceptable for now, right?
Sure. Yeah. It's been open, I think, for about a year because I was like, I mean, just do it 3 times.
Yeah. Yep.
This episode is brought to you by Triplebyte. Applying to programming jobs sucks. You have to put the right keywords in your resume. You spend hours and hours on the phone screens and take-home projects, and that's assuming the company even responds to your application. Well, if you're a software engineer, Triplebyte can help. They work with over 400 top tech companies, from big names like Dropbox and Adobe to exciting startups. You do one brief online interview with them, and if you do well, you go straight to final interviews with the company on their platform. It's like the Common App for software developers. Triplebyte does not look at your resume or where you went to school. All they care about is if you can code. I've helped dozens of software developers with various credentials get jobs, and this looks like a terrific way for you to get in and get interviewed and get a job without a lot of the hassle and overhead. You can go check them out at triplebyte.com/elixir. That's triplebyte.com, byte as in 8 bits. As a special offer for listeners of this show, if you take a job through Triplebyte, they'll offer you a $1,000 signing bonus.
So some of the other things I think would be interesting for you to talk about would be like the security features that you see in Plug and Phoenix, and kind of from a security standpoint, how do those work well, and what do you like about them?
Yeah. So I guess I sort of even touched upon this a little bit earlier, but the Elixir web ecosystem, it just does a really good job of preventing you from making the easy mistake. So I mentioned with SQL injection that it's something that you really have to force upon yourself to be vulnerable to it. But there's even nice little features in like in Phoenix, the fact that just the default redirect doesn't allow you to redirect to an external application or website by default. That's something that's, not super critical, but is a nice to have. I mean, this kind of functionality is just sort of throughout the code bases. So I guess as another example, this is something that I had asked Jose and Chris about, was a common vector for cross-site scripting. So I was going to introduce a check for this in Sobelow, and I thought, maybe see if we can fix it upstream and it just wouldn't be an issue at all. But basically, a common issue that people have is they create a link with link to, and then they allow anybody to put they allow the users to fill out what the link would be. So just so you're building a web application, users have profiles, they can input their website. So then the user puts in a JavaScript URI as their website. Then if you click it, then you have cross-site scripting. So I was going to put a check for that. And I brought it up in an issue, and they're like, okay, yeah, let's just fix this. And by default, we won't allow JavaScript URIs. So there's some whitelist check for, is this a non-offensive URI? So is it just like HTTP, HTTPS, or some kind of a path? So I think things like that are really cool.
Yeah, that is actually really cool. So is that like default to not as sharp edges in some case, as opposed to trusting you to run with scissors? Sometimes you just don't need to run with scissors.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's awesome that you saw the opportunity to work with people upstream and to kind of cut off a whole class of bugs before they actually come out. So kudos to that one. And so what are some of the other things that you think might still need work in the ecosystem where we should maybe turn our attention?
I think that there's a few things, and I've also got some like pet projects that aren't maybe as critical, but I think the biggest thing for the ecosystem would be actually validating the security guarantees that are made from different like default OTP applications. So like I was mentioning earlier, the root of security issues is in just like believing that something functions one way and then not like those beliefs being incorrect. So I think that there's a lot of default functionality that comes with OTP applications. And there was actually a talk that Bram gave that I think is a pretty decent example of what I'm talking about, where basically if you're using the HTTP client module and you're making a request to an HTTPS URL, it doesn't actually validate certificates or anything like that by default. So I think that the biggest thing that we could do in the ecosystem is, one, addressing that where possible, and where it's not possible, just documenting it.
And I think some of that does, you kind of have to put on that adversarial hat, right? To kind of take an actual conscious effort to look for those kinds of vulnerabilities or potential issues.
Yeah, exactly. So I had a question just generally related to authentication, authorization. What are the most common mistakes that you see people do in that area? Because I feel like there's a lot. And did you want to discuss sort of what your ideal setup looks like? Just because why wouldn't I get that point of view when I have you here sitting in front of me?
So, the very most common issues are kind of the lower severity, just not as secure as it could be sort of issues. So the way that, and so I talked about this a little bit in my my Elixir Conf talk in 2017, and it's as true today as it was then. But if the default session for a plug application, and so by extension Phoenix application, is that it's just a signed cookie that has some session state in it. The way that people tend to use that and validate it is by just like storing a user ID in there, and then they check that user ID and they're like, great, this is a user, or storing an admin flag in there or something. So the problem with this is that it just one, it could be replayable. Two, how do you actually log out of that? Because the user ID isn't going to change. So you create an issue where it's just like a session that's basically valid forever. So again, that's kind of like a minimal issue, but it is an issue. And that would be the most common thing.
Okay. So one other thing I wanted feedback on, because I know that I did this incorrectly quite a bit. OAuth. So I know that that my initial OAuth setups were bad. I learned as I was reading the OAuth spec. So I didn't know if you did run into that. Just poorly thought out OAuth strategies.
So for OAuth, there's, I guess, a million ways that you can go wrong there. And it's just, it has everything to do with just like really following the specification. I think OAuth type stuff tends to come up a lot with the Elixir community, just because some of the most popular and robust authentication providers or provider libraries out there currently are, like Guardian with OAuth and JWTs and things like that. So I guess I wouldn't necessarily say that there's like something that's super common, but it is something. But there are, just a lot of issues that come up with OAuth just because it is a complex specification. Okay,
good enough. I'm always okay with go read the spec.
Yeah, it's not a super satisfying answer, but there is, once you know what you need, because you don't need the entire specification, but once you have the piece that you need, following that to a T is where it has to happen.
So in that kind of explanation, you mentioned Guardian as a library that is available in the Elixir community. Are there any other libraries that you recommend that would maybe be a good best practice to start with? Anything like that?
There is an authentication library that I looked at that I actually quite like. It's by the guy that did Come On In. Let me find it real quick. Yes. So it's by Riverrun. It's called, well, I don't know if I can pronounce it, but like Foth. It's an authentication library that's fairly minimal if you're used to something that's, or at least what it was when I looked at it. If you're used to something really full featured, but I like it. It looks secure. It's by the guy that did, Come On In, which is the password hashing library. I think I probably betrayed the fact that I just always roll my own authentication for my Elixir side projects, which I think that there's a lot of largely solid guides out there to help you do that, and it's easy enough.
I'm actually really glad that you recommended Foth. I pronounce it Foth. I know David, the guy that wrote it. It's really good, and I've used it in a couple of iterations. It's kind of changed API a pretty good bit, but I feel like it's pretty stable now.
Yeah, it's definitely, if anybody asks for a library, that is my go-to recommendation.
That is a great resource to have. And because it is a difficult thing to pronounce, it is in the show notes, and it starts with a PHAUXTH. So yeah, I don't know how to pronounce that either.
On a not at all Elixir related note, I'm just curious, do you have thoughts on SAML as an authentication method? Because my thoughts are I hate it every time I've dealt with it.
So I actually haven't had to look at SAML much for security purposes, but as an ex-developer who's had to deal with it, I just agree. I hate it. OAuth is a much nicer specification.
So one of the things you mentioned is like that you have this allocated time to work on things like this, like Sobelow. If you can speak to it, I'd just be curious about like what some of your other time is done. Is that like consulting for companies? What kind of activities are you doing as a security analyst?
Yeah, so my job is outside of the free time where I get to do fun things like this, is exclusively in consulting for companies. So it's basically looking at their web applications, iOS applications, networks, things like that, and finding vulnerabilities and telling them how to fix them. So it's very traditional security consulting work. So I don't know if there's anything exciting in there that you'd want to know about.
Well, as part of that, identifying things and teaching people, like, hey, you made this mistake. It's excusable, but here's how you fix it. Trying to be nice to them, not make them feel stupid. But I wonder if there's any recommendations you have for resources, training, anything like that. I know there's the OWASP Foundation. Like I've gone through security training multiple times, and we're always looking at like the OWASP top 10. So I was just wondering what kind of resources you might recommend for people, point them to.
I really think that everybody should be reading the Web Application Hacker's Handbook. If you're building web applications, if you're interested in breaking web applications, it's really just an invaluable resource. And if you're a developer, I think my recommendation would be read it. You don't necessarily have to understand everything that's happening in there, but it's it's that last 10% that I was talking about earlier, where if once you've learned that something's possible, then you can avoid it in your own code.
That looks really interesting. I'll have to take a look at that book. Because like you said, even though I'm not looking at it from the perspective of a security analyst, just knowing that, there is this class of vulnerability exists over here, and see some examples about how that works just to raises my awareness. So I can be a better developer in that way.
Sounds like something that just makes a good reference manual or reference guide.
Yeah, it is really a great resource, and I recommend it to everybody.
Is there anything else that you would like to talk about or mention before we go to picks?
So I guess one last thing I'd like to say is, I really think that the Elixir and Phoenix core teams are just awesome when dealing with security issues. I do a lot of just independent research and try to find vulnerabilities in all the different things. And every time I bring anything up to them, they're great. So I guess just a kudos to them.
That is good to hear, especially as just a member of that community. So I appreciate that they are responsive and that you're able to reach out and have that avenue of making any kind of reports like that. That's awesome.
It's nice to know they have our back. Really appreciate the thing. One of the things that brought me to functional programming was the getting rid of classes of bugs. So knowing that that's happening sort of at the core library levels too is very nice and seems like an extension of like that philosophy that I like.
All right. Well, let's go to picks. Josh, did you have one that you wanted to share?
I have a series of related ones. The first thing I was going to mention was this service called Librem One. It's from the folks at Librem who make this Purism line of laptops, and they are open source software loving people. They have core boot on them. They have separate USB security keys that can ensure that the BIOS hasn't been tampered with. It's really cool. And they have hardware switches on things like the Wi-Fi and the GPS and the Bluetooth. Anyway, so really cool line of laptops. I don't have one, but they're on my list. But the thing I'm really excited about from the Librem folks is a thing called the Librem 5, which is a Linux phone, basically. I had the Nokia N900, and it was one of my favorite things. And sadly, it just kind of nothing came to replace it, largely because Microsoft bought Nokia at exactly the wrong time for me, but that's another story. So anyway, there's this thing called the Librem 5, and it should be coming out third quarter. But just watching this company works very much in the open on their GitLab. Their issues are like public issues about product direction that are very open to conversation, and they do all the work out in the open. It's just really nice to see it. They're making the GNOME ecosystem better because they're building everything on top of that. And I'm an open source zealot, and I'm really happy that they're doing this. So I wanted to show people. And the Librem One is just a sort of hosted services like. I just signed up, and they have a Mastodon service, and they do Matrix chat. And there's other stuff you can pay for, but I haven't done that yet. Anyway, just really cool. Wanted to show people.
Awesome. All right. I had a couple. Let's see. So the first one was just recently at the time of this recording, Elixir 1.9.0 release candidate 0 came out. And so I just appreciate that this is the march forward towards the release of 1.9.0. The major new feature in this release is the bundling of releases into Elixir core, which is the ability to create an Elixir or an OTP release, which is compiling so that it can deploy as a package that contains the runtime and the Beam runtime and everything that needs as part of your deployment. And so I'm just excited for that moving forward. Looking forward to that. I've been playing with releases off of the master branch, so I'm excited for it to come out. The other one is a tool called JQ. I have used this. It is a Java, like a JSON query kind of language is what it is. If you're using something like Linux, it's already part of the built-in installed Ubuntu. You can brew install it on Mac OS. When I was been working with REST APIs and I'm wanting to automate things like with curl commands, like as part of build scripts and things like that, then it's able to actually make a curl command to a REST endpoint that returns JSON, and then using this query, this JQ library, I'm able to query down into and pull out the pieces of data that I need. And so it's something I found really helpful. So I was going to include that one. So that's it for me. Griffin, how about you?
Yeah, I have a couple as well. The first one is the anonymity bibliography, which is just a selection of papers in anonymity. I think kind of hand in hand with like security stuff is privacy things. So something I'm really interested in is privacy, anonymity, things like that. So this is just a bunch of papers that I have not read nearly all of them, but a lot of them are interesting. And if you start at the very beginning and you think with an adversarial mindset, you'll be able to find a lot of vulnerable designs, and you can see them get better as they go. So that's kind of fun. The second pick, and not to talk too much about NCC Group today, but it is some more research from NCC Group. This is something that a couple of my friends did, / coworkers, but it's just assessing unikernel security. And it's a white paper that is really good, really interesting, and it kind of fits in with that the notion of knowing what guarantees you're actually getting, because there's this idea that unikernels are more secure for this reason or that reason, and I think the paper addresses those.
Very cool. All right. Well, Griffin, it has been awesome talking with you today. I'm glad we were able to talk about Sobelow. I wanted to help raise the awareness of the community that such a tool, that is an awesome tool, that it exists. And if people would like to follow you online or connect with you, where would you direct them to go to do that?
They can find my website, which is just griffinbyatt.com, or follow me on Twitter if they like the combination of security, Elixir, and scary movies.
Awesome. Well, that's it for today. We hope you'll join us next week on Elixir Mix.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.